How can we approach prayer with more confidence, with more expectation of seeing results, and recognize how important this is? That a pattern we see repeatedly is how God has, in many ways, limited himself to work through his people, that it requires our participation. And one of the most profound examples is in Isaiah, where God desired to show mercy rather than judgment. And he lamented that there was no one standing in the gap, that none of his people were standing in the gap so that he could pour out that mercy he so desired to give. And it's the recognition that God has called you to be that living demonstration of his goodness. An aspect of that is being that conduit of his blessing and his power. And not just to your immediate circle, but in every assignment in your life. He's calling you to be his representative, that conduit, again, that he can flow through and bring blessing, life, and hope into every situation. But how do we approach that with confidence? And Jesus said something profound to the disciples. Never before have you asked in my name. Ask and receive that your joy may be full. Literally, not just they had never asked in his name, never before in the history of mankind do we have the privilege of approaching God in the name of Jesus with expectation. But what about that thing that trips us up about what about God's will? And that is, to a degree, legitimate, that there are things that won't be done because it is not part of God's will. And we can oversimplify it by just what's in the Bible and what's not. But what if there's an approach? What if there's a way that you can approach God with greater confidence, greater expectation, and grow in that role of being that kingdom warrior that's bringing the difference, bringing the literal aspect of heaven down to earth? So we'll look at two sections. The first one is the understanding that James says that you have not because you ask not. And the reality is so many of God's people are passive, just taking the approach, God's all powerful, he's all knowing, God would do, but we'll wait and see. But James says you have not because you ask not. But he also goes on and says, so we have that encouragement, ask, but he goes on and says, but you receive not because you would spend it on your pleasures. In other words, your approach is entirely selfish. And so again, how does that help us? Well, the challenge is to ask, but how can we know that we're approaching in boldness, in confidence, and that it's in God's will? First John says that if our heart doesn't condemn us, then we have confidence towards God and we receive what we ask of him. Now, there's a couple of ways we can interpret that, which are all valid. One is, if our heart doesn't condemn us, referencing sin or some issue in our life. But the other is taking the approach of God. Before we ask, reflecting upon, examining our own heart, is this selfish or is this an aspect of a generous God? Will this overflow? Will it be strictly about me or will this overflow? And it's one of those that at first may seem a little difficult because again, we struggle sometimes to understand our own motives, but over time you will grow in the confidence. And in those times when you're really unclear where your heart is in it, is it literally something that will overflow to benefit others? Continue, reflect, take that extra time. But also do it all in the context of an absolutely outrageously generous and loving God. That understanding that where we so often get hung up is exactly where he wants to bless. I'll give you a great example of my own life. A few years back, I actually won a BMW convertible. And I parked it in the garage. I literally would almost never drive it because I was convinced that God was at some point going to tell me to give it to someone. So it looked good. It sat there. I took care of it, but I didn't really enjoy it. And then there came the moment God said, no, I gave you that car. And from that moment, I not only enjoyed it, but I shared it. I loaned it to people. How many people use that car who came to visit us and that would use that car to go explore San Diego, California, even all the way out into Arizona? People just enjoyed it. It was a blessing, not just for me, but for others. But I was stuck initially on it seemed selfish to just enjoy that. Now, that may not be the greatest example, but we need to understand, we need that recognition of the generosity of our God. And we need that greater boldness, that greater confidence in coming to Him in prayer. And when we approach it, when we take that moment to reflect upon our heart, if we have that check, if we have something that just is tapping the brakes, take that extra time. And if you're convinced that it is purely selfish, maybe just put it on the shelf. But if it's not, and if you don't see the results right away, what are we to do? Well, Jesus said, knock, seek, ask. Continue, continue. That part of it is that tenacity, that perseverance. That's what's it doing? It's building our spiritual strength. Coming to God in prayer, coming to Him, asking and receiving so that it can be that overflow blessing is an absolute necessity. We've got to shift from this passive mindset. And don't wait until it's a major issue. Start now. Find something in your life, in your immediate circle, in one of your assignments, where you want to see that visible demonstration of God's power. Examine your heart. Take the time to reflect upon it. Is this really a blessing, or is it purely selfish? But even if we get some benefit, even if we get some enjoyment, but if it is that greater blessing, come boldly before the throne of grace. Begin to pray, begin to ask, become that conduit of God's blessing and power. Begin to exercise that right as a son and daughter of the living God. Start now. If you need to, start small, but start now and grow in that power and in that confidence. And watch God touch the world around you.